All right, thank you very much, and thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to be here with all of you today. And I think it's Tom back there who asked the question. So Tom talked about psychological aspects, and I didn't pay him to create the segue for me. But we're going to talk about psychology. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and so we're turning things a little bit, right? Changing channels a bit. I focus on language, memory, attention, perception. These are the areas that I most often work in. And what I want to do today is tell you about a paradigm or a relatively new finding that we referred to as survival or adaptive memory, and how it has a relationship to evolutionary issues that all of you are highly familiar with, and how it's been something very interesting for cognitive psychologists, particularly those of us who are focused on memory phenomenon. So the title of my talk is Survival, Death. I threw death in there. Death is related to survival. And the supernatural. So we're going to talk a little bit about what individuals might fear that might be part of the unknown, or might be in their psyche, or might be something that they think about and not necessarily something that might be tangible per se. So the dilemma, and what we've been talking about, is the notion formed by at once foreseeing approaching death, thinking about death, thinking about whether it's near, and at the same time having faith in one's survival. So the struggle with trying to survive and fight for one's survival, avoid all of those things that would make it challenge to survive, the instinct to live, but also knowing that death is inevitable, as we've talked about, so that fear of death. So I'm going to talk more on the survival side. How does the notion of survival or needing to survive, how does that affect cognitive processing? How does that affect issues of our memory? And it's all a very interesting endeavor, knowing that when we get started talking about memory and how evolution is related to memory or evolutionary processes, we know that memory is bad. Human memory is bad. Human memory is very fallible. Human memory can be reconstructed. It's very malleable. We all know, we think about, I can't remember, the classic, what I had for breakfast or something to that effect. So as a cognitive psychologist, we're always very interested in how we can improve memory and memory processes. So we look at those types of phenomenon, whether they occur at the encoding of information or retrieval of information, or even something that might impact the storage of information in memory, to see how we can improve some of those processes. So this area of survival memory has been originated and pioneered by Jim Nairn at Purdue. And these are now the sort of classic papers, but as you can see, they only go back about 10 years. So this is a baby effect. It's a relatively new effect in the literature. That journal is the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, and Work in Psychological Science. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this paradigm and how it relates to survival, the avoidance of death, and then tell you about some manipulations that have happened. I hope that it'll generate a lot of questions from you, because there are a lot of areas that are yet to be explored. So I'm actually presenting something to you that doesn't have a whole lot of data and evidence, and so maybe it will be up to you to decide on this phenomenon. So some of their work, they think back about why has memory evolved? Then this is one of their titles, Adaptive Memory, Remembering with a Stone Age Brain. So we're looking at reasons that memory evolved to enhance reproductive fitness, accordingly, to tune these systems, to retain information towards our longevity and fitness relevant, in particular, reproduction. So we know a lot about human memory, but very little about its function. And if a lot of our processes have evolved over time, how has memory evolved? Why has memory evolved? What's important about memory? And in fact, we need our memories, right? That's a lot of the functioning that we do day to day, is the remembering information, encoding that information. So it's a very important human function. And to say that it maybe have some connection to these evolutionary theories, this is what's been very important in very recent times. So we don't know that, we might not think memory is associated to simply, remember facts in the past, but there's something more. There's something that we're attuned to in memory that we're sensitive to certain kinds of information, and you'll see it embedded in the paradigm. And what are these solutions that are derived by our memories that are associated with reproduction and reproductive fitness? So we think about the mnemonic consequences, the advantages of processing information in terms of its survival value. And I'm sure that you could just immediately think of a few, knowing where to secure food and water, safety, and so on, and how to locate mates, and so on. So to the extent that an item is processed in terms of its survival relevance, we might expect it to be remembered much better. And it might lead to a new form of mnemonic aid, something that allows for retention relative to shallow forms of processing. So we talk in cognition about how deeply or shallowly we might process information and how that leads to memory, and eventually how that leads to improved retrieval of that information. So if you're just looking at a word in terms of what letters it contains, very low-level features, it may not improve your memory as much as thinking about the meaning of the word, using the word in a sentence, or considering its antonyms or its synonyms, for example. So in this now classic work, again, it's only like 10 years old, subjects imagine themselves in one of several situations, and then they rate the relevance of a set of words. And after that rating task, individuals are given a surprise and incidental test of their memory for those words. So let's look at a sample passage. This is the classic passage. In this task, we would like you to imagine that you are stranded in the grasslands of a foreign land without any basic survival materials. Over the next few months, you'll need to find steady supplies of food and water and protect yourself from predators. We are going to show you a list of words, and we would like you to rate how relevant each of these words would be for you in this survival situation. Some of the words may be relevant, and others may not. It's up to you to decide. Now, we have various controls, and controls that have been studied over time. It's a very similar passage. This one's called the moving scenario. And you jump towards the middle. Over the next few months, you'll need to locate and purchase a new home because you're moving to a foreign land, and transport your belongings. Right? So there's still a schema of some movement happening and so on, and certain things that need to be secured, and that should also help you be successful in that environment. We're also still going to show you a list of words, and they would be the same words. These types of manipulations have been done between subjects and within subjects, very similar findings. So that's a control. And there's also another scenario, the pleasantness scenario. In this task, we're going to show you a list of words. We'd like you to rate the pleasantness of each word. So you're given a similar scale, and you have to rate these words. So this is really a condition where you're basically rating the words. Imagine that under all those conditions, it's the same words that are presented to individuals. And here's an example of a set of words that Naren has used. Some of us have used different ones, right? A number of different objects. And again, you go about the task of rating these items. All right, so to show you the typical data here, if you look at the left, on the x-axis, survival, moving, and pleasantness, the y-axis is proportion correct. That's free recall for the words that you rated under that condition. And what you can see in the extreme left is the highest bars for the survival condition, and that rate of remembering is significantly higher than it is for moving and pleasantness, and there's no difference there. What you can see is the average rating is the middle graph, the average score on this rating. There's a scale from 1 to 5. They're all similar. There are really no differences. So you're not remembering more of the words in the survival condition simply because you've given them higher ratings of relevance. That's not the case. And if you look at the extreme right, response times to actually make these ratings are all similar too. There really aren't any differences here. Yet, again, looking at pure memory, memory seems to be enhanced if you encoded these words when you were in the survival condition. Something about having read that passage and considering its contents and then moving to this rating actually enhances your ability to then perform exceptionally well at an incidental task, a surprise memory test, right? So Nairn went on, as good cognitive psychologists do. We try to play with the effect. We try to see when it's there, when it goes away, how robust the effect is. And there are a number of other conditions that Nairn was working with, and some of them are very classic in cognition and in memory. We'd like you to rate these words for imageability. How easy or difficult is it to arouse mental images of the word? So this could be another condition. We give them some examples and so on, tell them how to do the task. Any word in your estimation arouses a mental image, how quickly or easy, so how quick or easy it is, and there's a basic scale for imageability, right? Well, another condition we might consider is generation. Here we're going to show you a list of words, and we'd like you to rate the pleasantness of each word. Some may be pleasant, some are not. But you'll notice that the first two letters of each word have been switched. So you will make each rating. You'll need to first mentally switch the letters in order to know what word you're rating and then cast your rating. So you're actually, in a sense, generating the word. So as an example, and all of these are the instructions given to participants, I-K-T-T-E-N, you would then reverse the letters. This is the word kitten, and you make your rating. So you're doing something more with these words. You're encoding them in a little different fashion than merely rating their pleasantness. How about intentionally learning? Gee, you have survival here. How about just saying, look, we're going to show you a list of words. We'd like you to try to remember these words. And when you do this, typically individuals consider all their strategies. They repeat them, they link them together. They might have taken intro, so they've got some peg word systems or what have you, right? So here's an intentional condition, right? This should be the most basic condition. We need you to remember these words. And in fact, you're going to have a future memory test. Well, okay, right? So what could be easier? All right, so when we take a look at proportion correct in all of these situations, and many of them are very basic ones used in human memory tests, we happen to find that survival really outperforms all the rest. And there are some very small differences across some of these, but in fact, the survival condition wins again. So having encoded information, and by way of rating that information, after having been exposed to this survival passage, seems to increase memory. And I will tell you now, we'll go through the whole thing. You may have your theories. It's not really well understood why this happens. All right, so Nairn concludes it's fair to think that survival of processing is one of the best, if not the best, encoding procedures yet identified in human memory research, at least when free recall is used as the retention measure. You also see the advantage in memory recognition tests as well. So this is the kind of effect that researchers wait a long time for, to say that there's something potentially new that's going to impact our study of memory. And Nairn proliferated the field. There's at least one paper published in all of these journals. So maybe it was a smart thing, I don't know, or Nairn likes PR. But there's a paper in every one of these journals at least. And so there's been a lot of replication of the effect. So Stanley Klein, this is the journal Memory and Cognition, started to ask the question, but do you really need to have an environment related to evolutionary adaptation in order to show the survival advantage? So starting to question Nairn's notion about evolution, did memory evolve for this? Is this why this is sort of the best mechanism for memory? So Klein questioned some of this. And it was interesting that his ultimate answer is no in his article, because he actually devised a scenario that says, in this task, I want you to imagine that you're trying to stay alive. So you're trying to avoid death, you're trying to stay alive, you're trying to do what you need to actually keep going, right? And so in doing so, he does find an advantage for this type of statement. So he's going to be arguing, or he has argued the notion that it doesn't necessarily need to be in this grasslands context or this evolutionary context. I'm sure that Nairn would argue, or we would argue, look, it's still a task that's teasing your survival. It's still a task that's having you consider wanting to stay alive, not wanting to be annihilated, not wanting the end to happen. And that motivation is something that we've already been hearing is very driven in us to preserve. All right, so you find it there. Now, the standard passage, the one devoid of the environment of evolutionary adaptation, again, also shows this effect. And then he's prompted other thoughts of research on thoughts of death. Is it again, mortality salience? Is it just the survival piece? Do you need to have sort of the grasslands in the background? So neither here nor there, because I think the idea is that survival, the avoidance of death, the fear of death, those are things that are motivating some mechanism in memory that's having you perform better with these tasks. So Soderstrom and McCabe, Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, wanted to further this, and of course there's so many questions that now you can study with this paradigm, and wanted to think about more modern survival scenarios. You have ancestor-consistent threats, for example, but what about a modern-day scenario? How do you pull this out? Maybe it doesn't need to be related to the grasslands necessarily, or do you summarize something from thinking about it in your current context? So then started these notions of trying to look at variations in predators. So different kinds of predators, our thoughts about these predators, and the question about whether or not these are items that also would stimulate your memory. Would you remember more information depending on the quality of the predator, whether or not there's an actual super predator? And of course, all of this is based on your notions of whether or not you should fear these other types of entities. And in this particular paper, they decided on zombies and thinking about how zombies and how people process that notion of zombies. And again, you're thinking about something that people have a belief about. I don't know that anyone's actually met a zombie, but I can't really speak to that piece, but maybe somebody has a story. So the notion of predators versus zombies, and are there these other entities? So they started changing and altering the paradigm here. And rather than the grassland, suppose you're in a city, right? So we all have to survive in the day-to-day. Maybe we can think about more modern passages, things that are more relevant. There's the grasslands, there's the city. The same types of things happen, and having to look for steady supplies of food and water, and you're protecting yourself. Now it could be from predators, from zombies, from attackers. So trying to get at whether or not you have to think more about the notions of the grasslands or the predators, or if in some modern context, in a day-to-day context that we have, if we're exposed to this type of material, then we have to perform a cognitive task. How might we perform that task? Well, these are the data for proportion correct, the same type of task of rating words and having to recall them. And what you can see that the two highest proportions here are the conditions where zombies are part. So city and attackers, something like that, the basic control of rating for pleasantness, thinking about the grasslands and the predators, that was good. But in fact, zombies did much better. So it didn't matter if it was a city or the grasslands, but that notion of having the zombie that you had to be careful about, that was the one that was motivating better recall. And in fact, whether or not the zombies were in the grasslands or the city didn't matter. Those two bars are identical, but that recall is significantly different from all the other conditions. So there's something now to say, well, then there's something about the predator. There's something about whether or not, what we think that particular entity, what kind of harm it can cause us, or how close it might be to our death. Are we getting closer with zombies than we might have with just the generic predator? Is that what we fear? Is that what we're trying to overcome? We were interested in thinking about that question, and I have the word fictitious threat here in quotations because I'm not going to speak to certain beliefs that people might have, and things might be very real to them. But this is the supernatural part of the presentation for us to think, what are the types of entities that we fear? And if trying to protect ourselves from the influence of those entities is going to bolster memory, to what extent, and does it depend what kind of predator it is that we're talking about? So we were looking at this in light of the standard survival advantage and then comparing recall. I'll also tell you, as a good cognitive psychologist, you want to make sure you have a number of conditions. You're really trying to work with the effect. Maybe you're studying the effect a little bit as much as you are studying the theory, the evolution, and so on. And we introduced the variable of bizarreness. Is it something about What's interesting about the passage, that it's salient, it's distinctive, is it bizarre? What is it that's triggering better memory in terms of cognition? And maybe we can find the same finding if we work with distinctiveness and bizarreness. And in fact, if we do, then it may not be so relevant to survival, but there's just something inherent in the language that's used that's triggering better memory. So the notion of distinctiveness and bizarreness is a very old theme in cognitive psychology, again, looking at memory enhancement and looking at what mnemonics might improve memory. So we wanted to take a look at that as well. Now, when you're thinking about the supernatural and you're thinking about college students, those are our participants, one of the things you need to do is find out what aspects of the supernatural might actually seem to these individuals to be potentially harmful. What do they consider a predator? And it's interesting, as we were designing this work, it was right about Halloween, so we were in that mode ourselves, and we were thinking, gee, you know, zombies, but what other types of predators, what do college students fear? What do they fear? How do they fear it to the extent that it's going to stimulate their memory? So, again, as a good cognitive psychologist, you have to get the data. You have to get the normative data. You have to find out what people fear. So we thought vampires. Well, there you go. Maybe a vampire. Okay, that might be fearful. And we started to think about vampires. Said, well, you know, how many vampires do you know? And we asked some students, what vampires do you know? So we started getting some responses. These are the vampires, right? Like, well, all right, you know, here you go. So they have knowledge of vampires. Oh, well, here's another one, too. Here's another vampire. Like, well, you know what? These vampires, they're getting friendlier by the minute. I don't know. Does that pose a threat or not? We're not very sure. Vampires are romantic. Oh, my goodness. They sweep you off your feet, right? And in fact, they're all over television, right? So we thought, you know, we definitely will have to norm this because popular culture, and in fact, considering our participants, we have to understand in what context they process this information. At least we were interested in that being part of the condition. It may not really matter if we're thinking about things that are just evolutionarily programmed or somehow developed and evolved over time for survival, but you know, we may be able to find a super predator, you know, something that really affects them. So we went about having our supernatural ratings task, and you can imagine the IRB, what interesting ideas they had when we were trying to get this through. So in our ratings task, we, you know, spare you all the details, but just note that we tried to, in a very controlled fashion, line up items that were positive and negatively valenced, you know, that were nouns, that had some similar features, put them into a rating task because we wanted to know which of these types, particularly the negative, like the vampire, zombie, and demon, where they were, where they fell in terms of negativity and valence, emotion, potentially arousal for this population. So at the end of the day, the words demon and zombie were recalled with equal frequency, and demon was rated significantly more negative than zombie, and then followed by vampire. So the term demon, the word demon, seemed to be something that caused a certain amount of arousal that was negative in valence. So we decided, well, maybe this is something that we want to look at as well. We've talked about bizarreness as well. So this is the basic food and water, protect yourself from predators. We had a condition that involved bizarreness. So this was the condition with bizarreness. Over the next few months, you'll need to find steady supplies of rust and dice. So they fit the sentence, but they probably aren't going to be contributing to your survival. And protect yourself from clowns. Okay, so would this type of language, would this scenario actually boost memory because of its bizarreness? And then you can imagine we did have the basic condition where instead of predators, we specifically entered the term demons. Right, so predators, demons, and then the bizarreness situation. Proportion correct. In fact, the demons, using the term demon, which is also something that these individuals would, you know, claim were negative. We know from focus groups and talking to these students, they fear demon. Demon is the type of term that for them conjures up a number of different visions. It's sort of the open predator in the sense. There are a lot of cultures, a lot of groups that can identify with the term demon. Demon and predator did very well closely, and in fact, both of those proportions, even though the differences were somewhat small, were better than pleasantness and clowns. So demon is in a sense a type of super predator, including something that in there. And again, you can compare this against intentional learning. You can compare this against a number of other situations. But when you're thinking that you're having to survive a predator or a demon, something is enhanced in the sense that when words are encountered, when a cognitive task is encountered, your memory is improved. This tells us that the average ratings, pleasantness aside, is a little bit different than the other scenarios, but there's really no difference in terms of the average rating for the words. This was, of course, before the recall task. This is how you get them to encode the words. Likewise, there's absolutely no difference in the amount of time that individuals spend thinking about the words and rating these words. That's a timed task, but they're not spending any more time with the words in the demon's condition or the predator's condition, right? Yet, you see that memory is enhanced. So being in a survival mode, this avoidance of death significantly affects the ability to remember information, and that seems to be very, very effective. It may draw from the notion of how memory has evolved, why you would want memory to work in a certain way, to actually help in terms of your longevity, thereby avoiding death. Presumed predators in the form of demons or zombies likewise tend to influence memory behavior. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
They're lovely studies, but I want to question the ecological relevance of some of them, not only in your studies, but the others. You ask people, you suggest them they have to find steady supplies of food and water. No one in the class has ever had to find a steady supply of food and water. These students in America just don't know what that means. They don't really know what predators mean either. What if you really wanted to do something which corresponded, at least metaphorically, to the survival situations in the past, you ought to be asking them about their grades. I mean, they really need to get really good grades in the next month or so. The library's shut or whatever it may be. In other words, make something actually relevant to their lived experience, and you might get even stronger effects if you did that.
Mm-hmm. We've had a few conditions and other things, works that we have piloted, and some of the way we have modified these things have to do with cheater detection, boyfriend, girlfriend. So we've gone down that road. What are the things that for students are, but we really haven't found anything that really works as well or as strong, at least in this population. Let's see, there's a cheater one, there's a mate poaching scenario. There's a scenario where somebody is looking at your paper and cheating from you. Those types of things. We've thought about what it is. There's another scenario where, you have a roommate in the dormitory, and what happens there as well doesn't seem to moderate things as much. Now, I will tell you, along the lines of your question, we have run these studies in a university in Nairobi, in Kenya. So we have the Kenyan students, we have used some of the same basic paradigms, and we cannot find the effect in that population. And so we've conducted focus groups with these students at the university, and some of them tell us, well, some of the things you talk about here, it's almost like a basic kind of everyday. There's nothing salient. There's nothing that gets our attention about that passage. And we've tried to dig a little bit deeper because we'd like to see what it is that might impact their survival in particular. And one of them told us a very interesting story. They said, well, if you want to know, what would move us in terms of our survival, we're going to give you an example from American film. And so one of them, a little group recounted, when we see movies that are made in America, and they include teenagers and, people like them, they said, they all go home and then they jump in their beds with their sneakers on. That this is terrible. This is so unhygienic, they cringe. They cringed. They said, we can't believe you do that. We would never do that. Why would you jump in your bed with your shoes on? This is terrible. So we're thinking now, because we have the Kenyan sample, we still have the ability to run studies there. And at the same time, Nairn is now working a lot on the notion of contamination. That it is contamination that in fact motivates some of this memory stuff in a sense. There are some studies, if some items or objects come into contact with something that's a contaminant, chances are you'll remember them better, right? And we were just talking about why that might be the case. So I don't know if in the Kenyan sample, if we devise something that has to do with their survival in the face of contamination, whatever is qualified as that, is that something that would motivate them to do this incidental task and remember these words?
The famous Bartlett study, I'm sure you know it, which we've all brought up on from his studies of memory. I can still remember the passage, that's from the passage, and then something black came out of his mouth.
Yes, War of the Ghosts, right, from Bartlett.
And,
That's right.
It's contamination from Randy straight off.
Yeah, when I was listening to Randy, I was thinking there's a whole line coming out right now with Nairn, and I think that's something, because the Kenyan population, and literally there's nothing, the bars are exactly the same. And actually with the Kenyan population too, we varied this with individualism and collectivism. So it's not just you that are in this scenario, but your family, so your family has to move, your family has to find, versus I have to find, I have to move. It's all flat, there's nothing we're pulling out. So we're thinking, because of the anecdote they gave us, that there are other things that for them impede their survival, or they perceive that. How do you capture that, basically?
In your study of how contamination concern affects memory, what you want to do is include would be to measure the values of the people. There's a good validated questionnaire, 18-item now, the political scientists have got it down to measure degree of conservatism, said differently, the degree of liberalism. And, the more conservative you are, the more contamination concern should affect memory.
Exactly. I'm going to ask you for that reference, because I'm working with my Kenyan colleagues now to run something coming up in the next few months, so I need to have something like this. That's exactly right. I don't know how it speaks to just the base level survival. I guess it really is. It really depends. I guess what I'm saying here, sure, there must be something ancestral, something you're looking at to survive, but it also has to be ecologically valid. It has to, resonate with what's happening in the time, right? So hopefully this was a little intro to cognitive psychology. Not as exciting, but I enjoy it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette.